Hi, I'm Matt Culkin, co-chair of Steptoe's Financial Services Group, and welcome to Steptoe's Financial Services University. We're pleased to present a series of short, focused conversations with my colleagues from across our firm's practice groups and in offices around the world. Today, we're going to talk about Latin America, what it's like to do business there, where there might be opportunity, and where there might be liability. I'm joined by my colleague Fernando Merino, also resident in our Washington office. Fernando, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Matt, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to contribute.
So let's start just sort of at the beginning. Can you just tell us a little bit about your area of practice, its focus, and what keeps you busy?
Sure, of course. So I am a Brazilian by background, got my law degree in Brazil, give or take about 30 years ago. It's been a while. I have done different things throughout my career. I had an opportunity to come to the US and work here as an associate. I did that for a couple of years and moved to London, and then went back to Brazil in the late 90s and spent, give or take, the last 20 years in Brazil doing a lot of work in-house primarily. So I was an in-house lawyer with financial institutions, with Credit Suisse at the time. It was a joint venture with Garantia, which is or was a bank owned by the current shareholders of 3G. 3G is best known here in the US for its joint venture with Warren Buffett, and they are the controlling shareholders of Anheuser-Busch and of Kraft. And after that, I moved to JP Morgan and then Merrill Lynch, now Bank of America, in a position of their chief compliance officer and general counsel for the region. After that, I moved industries. Actually, was a really difficult move at the time and challenging, and I became the chief legal officer for large Brazilian companies. The first was in the infrastructure business, metals, mining, railroads, and the second was in the retail side. Had that role for give or take 8 years, and decided it was the time to come back to private practice and engage in a conversation with Steptoe, and here I am. And I've been based in DC for give or take about 3 years.
And over those 3 years, I'm assuming you find yourself on airplanes quite regularly.
It is true. It is true. I would say that probably traveling takes about 40% of my time, give or take, or 50%. Prior to joining Steptoe, I was also a board member in two Brazilian companies, listed companies, so that required me to attend board meetings. But in addition to that, I am regularly traveling throughout the region, both attending client matters or just talking to people in general to get a sense of what's happening. So I would say that probably every given month I am in the region once or twice. So that was my average. And then, of course, there are a lot of trips to New York and a lot of trips to Europe, particularly with Latin American companies that are doing business there, and that would require assistance and help. And sometimes you need to be there in person. So it's a long answer to say yes, fair amount of traveling.
And when in your practice now, what sorts of matters do you find yourself working on?
Uh, Very good question. And perhaps unlike other of our colleagues, I have a very varied practice, probably because of the nature of my own background. So it sort of depends on the nature of clients' needs and the reasons why they're calling us. Um, I think worth mentioning, there's a fair amount of work on the regulatory side, be it on compliance, be it on financial services. There's some work that's been going on the pure corporate side, which is investments by international companies in the region or vice versa. Local companies are coming here, both in the real economy and the digital economy. And last but not least, a lot of cross-border disputes, in particular arbitrations, and there's been a fair amount of increase about that. So just thinking about a couple of examples, uh, in taking Brazil, which is my home country, perhaps a lot of people don't realize that Brazil is actually about the same size as the US. There's over 200 million people living in it, and it's the 10th largest economy in the world from a GDP perspective. Perhaps more interesting, it has a very high penetration, internet penetration via mobiles as opposed to laptops. So it's a different type of device. That means that it is a very relevant market for giant, digital companies such as Facebook and WhatsApp. That if you combine that with a somewhat arcane regulatory system, there's a lot of inefficiency in terms of how services are provided or how companies are served and customers are served. So there's a lot of investment and development that has happened on the tech side in Brazil, for instance. So we help clients that come to us from Brazil that want to access markets here in the U.S., but we also help a lot of clients in the U.S. that want to understand what they can do in that space in Brazil. So that's one of the elements that we've been doing. Second, Brazil has now very, very historically low interest rates. 2%, it may not sound that low here, but it's historically very low. That has led local investors to look for alternative investment opportunities in more mature markets and look for better yields. We've seen a lot of the high net worth individuals or families coming to the U.S. to invest or to do business here. That same reason has led the country to really embark on a large privatization program that has seen the insurance market opening up. We now have utilities that are being privatized, including electricity, water, and sewage. So there's a fair amount of foreign investment, and we have helped companies and our clients on that type of space. Now, culturally, the country is very different, and the regulatory environment is very different. And as such, there are a number of pitfalls. Part of our work has really been on the pure compliance side, helping people step up their programs or consider amendments or improvements, or in investigations. A lot of people are familiar with the so-called car wash investigation, which is a widespread investigation into corruption allegations in connection with a company called Petrobras. We have been involved on a number of matters involving car wash, be it representing individuals, international companies active in Brazil, or Brazilian companies that may have had issues here. So really, Matt, it's my practice is a bit varied. It's a combination of different things.
But what I find interesting about your practice, and we've talked about this at great length, is that many lawyers and their clients practice in a defensive stance, trying to minimize risk and address the potential hypothetical that things go sideways. I found that you often spend a lot of your practice expanding opportunity and helping clients capitalize. But I'm curious to pivot back. Are there sort of common pitfalls or mistakes that you see either when American companies go into Latin America or Latin American companies transact or invest in North America?
That's actually an excellent question. Okay, and I have experienced that from different angles. Right, when I was in-house, and headquarters would say, here's a policy on FCPA, and by the way, we want to apply it for good reason, very consistently throughout the world. So you have to do exactly as you're told in this policy. However, that policy won't necessarily take into account the local regulatory environment, or quite candidly, the local culture in terms of what is acceptable and not acceptable. So I think there is a need to really consider how you get the protection that you need and you want, without sometimes necessarily having to follow 100% of the book as it was presented to you by the headquarters. So as a substantive matter, you're getting the protection that you need while respecting the local culture and the local environment, and particularly your customers, your clients. And you're also not engaging in discussions with them and losing time discussing topics that are perhaps not as relevant as the business itself, right? That's much easier said than done. There's a lot of issues that you have to navigate to get there, but I think that's one item. The second item. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious. You've talked a little bit about the cultural difference, and I would imagine, particularly when you travel, that you're able to connect either with a regulator or a client face to face in a way that's maybe different than if you were operating from Washington permanently or New York City.
I think that's absolutely right. And I guess we will all agree that the personal contact and the interface generally is positive and makes a difference, right? One of the challenges we're living, right now in the current times. But in certain cultures, in particular, I would say Latin cultures, and I would include in that the South European countries, Italy, Spain, this sort of personal interaction and communication, I would say it's even more relevant. And developing a relationship of trust, it's something that takes time. And sometimes it takes more time than you would think. So that's, one important aspect. The other important aspect is that people come from different regulatory backgrounds. So if your background is, an English background in terms of how the framework works, or the U.S. background, and you go to a civil law country, when they think about the word investigation, when they think about how they're going to interact with regulators, that can be very different. And let me perhaps give you one example that never ceases to surprise me. Under civil procedure rules in civil law countries, typically you don't have the concept of the discovery as you have in the US, including the fact that you're not required to produce evidence that goes against your case. That is a completely different dynamic than, for instance, what you have in the US. And that difference governs the way people think about the legal strategy and what they're going to need to produce or not. So frequently, when I'm talking to a client that is based in the UK, or in particular based in the US, that has cross-border litigation, and one of the elements of that litigation is litigation in Brazil or Chile, for that matter, this is an issue that frequently we'll cover and have to explain that, look, we have to address this from a different perspective because that's not what people are focused on down there, or the opposite for that matter.
Well, Fernando, thank you for joining me today. This has been incredibly interesting.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Wish you all the success with the university. Thank you.
Well, that does it for another episode of Steptoe Financial Services University, where we dove into the very exciting world of doing business in Latin America. You can watch more of our Steptoe Financial Services University classes and learn more about our financial services practice at steptoe.com. Thanks for watching.